So those who have been around the channel for a while know that I'm also an animator, and Crash 4 took me by surprise with how it looked. Activision provided me a review code, and since this isn't a game for a direct port comparison, I'd be more than happy to gush about the animation for a little bit. So if you're down for this kind of content, let me know. Crash was created from the ground up to be a 3D platforming character. His shape, proportions, and colors were chosen to make him and his silhouette readable from all possible angles you'd see him in a 3D space. The long limbs give him a unique silhouette, his giant face helps exaggerate his emotions to make them readable, his torso and shorts contrast in solid, untextured colors, and his gloves and shoes contrast, helping you recognize him from more angles. Crash was inspired by Looney Tunes TV animation and later shows such as the Animaniacs. This style of TV cartoon animation is known for its exaggerated squash and stretch, anticipation, pose to pose, follow through, and arc. And there's utilization of motion smears, facial expressions, deformation of character, body horror, slapstick gag comedy, and full body animation, as opposed to most TV animation that, for budget and time reasons, wouldn't animate more than necessary. In this video, we're going to start with a quick overview of the animation of the original 3 Crash games on PS1 and Vicarious Visions remakes of the game. Then we'll follow up with a review of the animation of Crash 4 by comparing it with the past titles and how they all have utilized various animation techniques, both in form and in function. Crash succeeded where other mascots failed through the creative programming and clever problem solving by the team at Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog's motto was, bite off more than we can chew, then figure out some crazy complicated way to make it work. I think a lot of programmers and designers can relate to this. To achieve the animation style desired for Crash, the team opted for vertex animation rather than just a skeleton system. This meant that they could deform the vertices of Crash's model however they wanted. However, real-time vertex animation was not something the PS1 was capable of. In fact, what the PS1 was capable of was really a mystery that Naughty Dog had to crack, as there was information that Sony just didn't share with all their developers, and their documentation was poorly translated to English, so it was even harder for Western studios. Andy Gavin, co-founder of Naughty Dog, explains how the games run and how the team had to basically exploit the PlayStation hardware to use it to its fullest potential. In addition, they had to figure out how to work around the inevitable limitations, which led to these signature tunnel-like level designs. Regardless of how the games look now, people believed in the first footage that Crash was fake. The level designs were carefully optimized for the hardware and the animations had to be compressed and baked. Other characters that tried to be the PlayStation mascot, while not entirely the fault of the developers, simply did not have Naughty Dog's ingenuity and resourcefulness. They just weren't capable of animating, expressing, or controlling this well. Now for the majority of looking back at the original games, we're going to look more so at Crash 2 and 3 going forward. Andy Gavin had rewritten the engine used for the games and the potential was taken even further with fewer compromises. Now Crash isn't a complex character, he's a crazy lunatic in the same vein as the silent Looney Tunes character. In fact, basically everyone in these games are basically lunatics, with the one exception being Coco to a degree. However, Crash 1 Crash is a kind of distinct character. He's so much more intimidated by the obstacles he has to face than the others. While Looney Tunes inspired, Crash is by no means a Bugs Bunny here. He isn't the source of the chaos, he is the victim. This trait kind of becomes more subtle in later games, but it's a trait nonetheless. Now, how do we infer this from how he's animated? Well, for example, given how often you'll see Crash run, it's an important animation for both his personality and it must be functional. The silhouette of his running animation is pretty clear from the sides, but remember that Crash was designed for 3D. I didn't mention staging as one of the principles earlier, but it is an important one for Crash. Arguably his silhouette from behind could be better, but his giant shoes or giant face supply the clarity that they need. Crash's face is important to his character as well. It's rarely ever standing still. I don't just mean his expression either, I mean his hair and his snout as well. They're always bouncing. And then there's the slapstick death animations. The narrative structure of Looney Tunes cartoons are pretty loose, and the flow of the cartoons is usually done through going from one gag to another, while Crash, being a game, has limited time for its cutscene moments, so most of the slapsticks represented in the death animations. Crash can die in so many obscure ways. We see the best exercise of the vertex animation approach here, like when Crash swells up like a balloon, or when he's flattened. So again, without this dedication to vertex animation that Naughty Dog had, other characters of this era just simply couldn't do this. With this recreation of the first 3 Crash games, Vicarious Visions aimed for authenticity and embellishment of the source material. It was important to keep the careful design choices of the character and still use vertex animation so that the face can emote as well as it did before, which can be a bit trickier with models this high poly. Not to mention, he has fur shaders now. The most significant upgrade here in terms of animation is that Coco is a fully realized playable character. While she plays the same as Crash, she's still full of her own personality. My favorite bit of her idle animation is this one where her phone explodes and it can actually explode TNT or nitro. Coco is a level-headed and grounded girl who seldom indulges in Crash's crazy. Their dynamic is a cliche for sure, but I always argue that a good, well-done character that's cliche is still a good, well-done character. She doesn't deform or stretch nearly as much as Crash, but she doesn't have to. It'd be out of character for her if she did anyway. Their run cycles distinguish the two pretty well. Look at how Crash's weight shifts haphazardly, but while Coco walks the same pace, she keeps her balance more centered. It doesn't just stop at the run cycles, but how they walk, slide on ice, run from boulders, and trek through muck. I appreciate the effort here to flesh out Coco, like she didn't have to have her own animation for the beginning of Crash 1, for example, and yet she did. If I had to nitpick, she did seem to get the short end of the stick when it came to the slapstick gag deaths. Speaking of, the slapstick death animations were also embellished with more detail, like finger gestures like when stuck in the snow, since these weren't possible on the PS1. Some of the original death animations did lack some clarity, like the one where Crash shrinks but you can still control him, but in the trilogy this is a set animation. Admittedly, there's a handful of ones I like more in the original, like Crash swelling up like a pufferfish in Crash 3, we're shown his face, which to me just looks funnier, but in the remake he keeps his angle at where he was blown up from, or how Crash will bounce multiple times through lava if he runs into it, but in the remake he just falls where he is. This was pretty intentional though. The Sane Trilogy shortened death animations across the board so that you can get back into the action faster. On the flip side, anytime Coco looks right at the player after a death, it's a pretty good touch. In Crash 1, Crash and Coco will now react to being hit with boxes constantly. When Sony greenlit this idea, it set a good rule of thumb as to the kind of leniency Vicarious Visions had. Not to mention, it was a clever idea. We can't forget the details added to the elements around you as well, such as for enemies or bosses. Like Tiny, who goes from holding his lance up, which is fine, to him planting it in the ground and roaring. Even better. Even when you're not focusing on the environment, all the foliage animation helps bring the atmosphere to life. Toys for Bob has set out to establish that while they're following up on a remake of the first 3 games, they can develop a competent experience worthy of being a direct sequel. They made a lot of choices to set their vision of Crash apart from what's been done before, while embracing the gameplay and story formula of its predecessors. I'm sure many were expecting the Sane Trilogy art style to stay, though this series isn't really known for its consistency between developers in the first place, so I feel that if the changes are made for a reason and not just for the sake of simply having change, I'm down for it. I feel that Toys for Bob wanted their own rigs and models so that they had total control over how they could deform them. I could see the fur shaders not playing nice with how much these characters can deform either. I think that by opting for pretty solid colors with subtle fur texture and the ability to deform the characters so much, Toys for Bob has actually succeeded and even arguably surpasses what Naughty Dog set out to do, in some ways. Crash's intentional design is left intact and he's so much more animated than before that he's basically beyond any kind of TV animation. Seriously, excellent job to the animators that worked on this game. Crash 4 has some of the most impressive, cartoonish, exaggerated 3D animation I've seen in a game. Toys for Bob's animators are flexing with every cutscene, pose, and facial expression. It is ridiculous how appropriately expressive every character in this game can be. These characters live by their exaggerated key poses and animations. Pausing at the right times will show us not just some hilarious motion stills, but how much these characters are able to exaggerate and to deform. Without the context, these animations just look so effortless. Now let's look at Crash and Coco's run cycles. The most notable change here is that jut forward they do when they start running. I found it kind of jarring at first, but this anticipation of Crash and Coco going from their idle to moving is made noticeably clearer at all angles thanks to this. And this will be a common theme among Crash 4's animations. All of their actions have more concrete anticipation and or recovery, but they're still quick, which keeps movement fluid, and the more exaggerated actions are saved for when you're not in control. Anyway, the line of action action is also a lot clearer here. These earlier run cycles are still great, of course. Crash in the first game was so scared, in Insane he's just the epitome of crazy, but here the posing's so clean that we can infer maybe there's more to Crash than just being a lunatic here now. We'll discuss that again a little later. This run cycle also holds the key poses for a noticeable amount of time compared to the past iterations. This is important across all of Crash's gameplay animations. Crash holds the key poses on his actions longer than before, thus making them clearer to the player. Coco is also more fleshed out in her personality. I love the idle animation where she sweeps her hair because it's visibly falling back down over time. My first thought seeing this was, does she get tired of sweeping her hair up all the time? And the answer turns out to be yes. Then the two still had their unique cycles for being on ice or being scared. However, I don't think there's any muck they have to trek through in Crash 4, but you do roll an acute cage ball from danger. I love this little ball because of the details on Crash and Coco while inside it. When you hit a hazard, they lose control of the ball and roll around in it before regaining their composure. While a pretty good detail, it's also functionally important because it's conveying to the player that when you hit these hazards, you're slowing down. So you should try to avoid making them spin in the ball unless you're an animator watching. Then there's the jump. In Insane in the original games, Crash has some visible stretching. Coco does too in some of her riding levels, but in Insane she doesn't stretch nearly as far in her jumps. Like we said before though, Coco doesn't have to stretch as much as Crash does. In Crash 4, Coco does this kick in her forward jump. This is a good detail because it keeps her as circular as Crash is when he does his somersault. This somersault is a gameplay choice to help really distinguish the forward jump from the jump in place and the crouching jump. And while Crash's jumps are symmetrical like they've always been, Coco's jumps are asymmetrical, and she holds her hand up when doing a double jump. This distinction makes sense, plus her tablet is offsetting her weight anyway, and this is kind of present in the Insane Trilogy as well, it's just not as exaggerated. Either way though, it is an important detail. On ice, the personalities contrast a lot. Crash is kicking his feet really fast, and at a stop he still isn't composed. There is no moment of comfort or feeling like he's in control. Coco, on the other hand, isn't trying to skate elegantly like she was in the Insane Trilogy, but she keeps her focus and does her best to stay composed. Admittedly, I do like the animations from her on ice in the Insane Trilogy more. In Crash 4, she is slowly fading back into her idle pose, but in the Insane Trilogy, we get a proper distinct sense of her being on ice. I also like Crash's swagger when he's walking in the Insane Trilogy, but I get that the swagger wouldn't be as indicative of his personality in Crash 4. Plus, there are now several characters that have to match the pacing of his step that aren't just Coco. Then we have the attack animations. New to this Crash game is the difference between the spin while standing still and while moving. The first thing I did when I saw this was check if it was in the older games, thinking I had noticed until now. And it is. Kinda. But it just wasn't shown in the animation itself. The one constant of the spin is that it always comes out frame 1, but the cool thing about it is always how the look of the spin itself is achieved. In most of the games where Crash spins, there's a separate model used for the spin itself. It isn't unheard of for games to literally model their motion smears, and it looks pretty convincing. The spin in Crash 1 had this very short recovery to it, but the other versions dropped this. Crash 2 incorporated the limbs, so it's clear he's using his foot in it too. Crash 3 had a different spin depending on the level. Some places had the same spin as Crash 2, but in some levels there's no limbs in it at all. Then the Insane spin is a sort of hybrid of the earlier ones. Now, I say that because the way the faces are stitched together kinda reminds me of how Crash 1 did it. There's also a recovery to it again. And these look great, but I am a sucker for how the motion smearing was actually modeled within the original spins. In Crash 4, the spin is really fast and straightforward, but the best part of this version is Crash's expression while spinning. Excellent touch of personality. The recovery part returns here too, so combine that with his face expressing, and this is definitely my favorite spin. Additionally, the dash spin is replaced with a spinning kick, which works great with being an attack that follows from the dash and further expands Crash's straightforward arsenal of moves. Their crawling animations are, interestingly, like basically the most animal-like animations they have. Just look at how focused Crash is on his prey. And once again, this crouch animation now has a clear anticipation. Ledge animations also return in Crash 4, which I found were previously only in some areas of Crash 2. These are great for signaling to the player that they're about to fall over. I love how Crash 4 treats its ledges because there's also a small force that keeps you you from falling over. As we know, the Sane Trilogy has issues with its edges, so it's cool that they added this. Then, when Crash or Coco jump off of ropes, they have this structured animation where they jump off. Like, the arc is consistent every time they do it. For precision-based platforming, the consistency of jumping off ropes is really appreciated. In terms of facial expressions, both of these characters' faces are practically defined by their personalities. Crash has this massive snout that he always works into his expressions, but he also has larger eyes to avoid being obstructed by it. He's able to be scared out of his mind, be loony, and, new to this game, be a lovable dummy. He's always quick to love and not directly cause the chaos. This lovableness is great as it adds more to his personality and without losing that craziness, and it reinforces how terrified he always is. Coco's eyes aren't as large, but she has a more orthodox face for more relatable expressions. Again, Coco is a more level-headed character. We don't see her deformed nearly as much since it'd be so out of character for her. It's more like Coco is just used to how insane everybody is around her. Everybody has their own reactions to the idea of replaying a level or moving on. Crash is afraid to go back through, which is that acknowledgement of how terrified he is. Coco's vibing with whatever the player wants, Tawna's like, meh, really? You wanna go back? And Dingodile and Cortex are just ready to go. Like, they had fun. Like, seriously, they had fun doing what Crash and Coco have been doing this whole time. Just look at how happy Cortex is to be jumping on the boxes. One thing I've kind of omitted so far has been the slapstick death gags in Crash 4, because most of the hazards that'll realistically get you will simply result in the angels. There's plenty of unique ones though after combing through for them. Each character has plenty. My favorite gag has to be the RC robot one. Not because of Crash turning into a skeleton, but because of the scientist doing the Mandark laugh. And Basketball Coco is probably my favorite gag out of all of these games. I know that there's been a ton of praising here. I do actually have my hang-ups with Crash 4. I played this game super casually, which offered such a fair and engaging challenge in my opinion. And while I don't 100% Crash games, I totally understand those trying to 100% are pretty miffed at how frustrating some of the design choices were. There is an obscene amount of collectibles and hidden boxes that are in levels that are really long with a lot of boxes. I could definitely see myself if I tried to push myself to 100% it, I would get downright angry. Otherwise, I just really love the animation in this game, man. So thank you for letting me gush here. I hope some game developers or animators could join in on the conversation here too. Whether you learned something or have any more comments, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And that's all I got for this video. If you like this animation talk, please let me know. In the meantime, till the next video, you can find me on Twitter and support me via Patreon. So till next time, thank you for watching.